In 2022, Elon Musk posted a warning he has repeated in various forms ever since. Population collapse due to low birth rates, he wrote, is the greatest risk to civilization. Not climate change, not nuclear war, not artificial intelligence getting out of control. People. Specifically, the fact that we aren't making enough of them. He called the trajectory crashing faster than any earlier computer models predicted. He called specific countries' birth rates mass extinction numbers. He has said the decline has been underway for years and is accelerating. He has said civilization itself hangs in the balance. This is not a fringe position anymore. Musk has more than 400 million followers. He controls the platform where much of this conversation now happens. And because he has a track record of making predictions that sound ridiculous and turned out to be right, the electric car going mainstream, reusable rockets landing themselves upright, a lot of people are wondering if he's seeing something the rest of us aren't. Before we evaluate whether he's right, I want to do something this debate almost never does. I want to show you what population collapse looks like. Not in theory, in the historical record. Because if we're going to argue about whether we're facing one, we should probably agree on what one is. In 1492, when European ships first made contact with the Americas, North America was home to millions of people. The indigenous civilizations here were ancient, diverse, and sophisticated. What happened to them over the following 2 centuries is the closest thing to genuine demographic catastrophe that human history contains. Disease arrived first, often before Europeans themselves did, carried inland by trade networks. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, diseases that had co-evolved with European populations over centuries, conferring partial immunity to those who survived. For indigenous Americans, there was no such immunity. Mortality rates in some regions exceeded 90% within a generation. Florida had an estimated 700,000 inhabitants in 1520. By 1700, approximately 2,000 remained. The Great Dying in New England, a series of epidemics between 1616 and 1619, killed an estimated 95% of the regional population before the Pilgrims even landed. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was not founded on empty wilderness. It was built on a graveyard. That is what demographic collapse looks like. It is sudden. It is externally caused. It leaves behind emptied cities, abandoned fields, the physical evidence of a world that was abruptly interrupted. It doesn't look like a line on a graph trending slowly downward over several decades. The Black Death offers a similar lesson. Between 1347 and 1352, bubonic plague killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. The estimates vary by region, but England and France lost roughly half. Recovery took well over a century, complicated by the fact that plague returned again and again, 30 times in England alone between 1351 and 1485. The demographic wound kept reopening before it could heal. The Roman Empire had its own encounter with what a real demographic shock feels like. The Antonine Plague, which swept through the empire between 165 and 180 CE, killed roughly 10% of the total population, somewhere between 5 and 10 million people, at peak killing 2,000 per day in the city of Rome alone. It came back 9 years later. It weakened the military, collapsed tax receipts, depopulated farming regions, disrupted the trade networks that reached from Egypt to Southeast Asia, and contributed directly to the period of instability historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. The city of Rome itself, which had held roughly 1 million inhabitants at its peak, was home to about 30,000 by the 6th century. The decline unfolded across 300 years. 300 years. That is the pace of demographic change even under catastrophic pressure. Even real collapse moves like a glacier, not a flash flood. Now contrast that with what Elon Musk and the modern population alarmists are pointing to today. The global fertility rate is approximately 2.25 children per woman, just above the 2.1 replacement level. The global population is still growing. It will keep growing until roughly the 2080s. when it peaks near 10 billion before beginning a slow decline. We are not running out of people. The rate of growth is slowing. That is a meaningfully different distinction. The number 2.1 is worth understanding because it anchors everything else in this conversation. It's called the replacement rate, the average number of children per woman required for a population to hold steady across generations without counting immigration. It's not exactly 2 because some children don't survive till adulthood, and because slightly more boys than girls are born. And here's something almost no one mentions in this debate. Below replacement fertility doesn't produce immediate population decline. It produces what researchers call population momentum. Even if every birth on Earth stopped tomorrow, global population would still grow for another 30 years. A world of below replacement birth rates is not a world that is emptying out. It is a world that is going to peak and then, slowly, start to plateau and shrink. Musk's word is collapse. The scientists who study this call it a transition. There's a pattern to population predictions across history. They are always wrong in the same direction. Thomas Malthus wrote in 1798 that population grows geometrically while food production grows only arithmetically, meaning population would inevitably outpace food, and famine would be the natural correction. The catastrophe never came. He hadn't anticipated the Green Revolution, or the power of human innovation to scale food production faster than population. Paul Ehrlich updated the panic for 1968 in a book called The Population Bomb, predicting mass starvation in the 1970s as overpopulation consumed all resources. The starvation never came. Population doubled to 8 billion. People are better fed and longer lived on average than at any point in human history. He was so confident he literally bet on it and lost. Malthus was wrong about too many people. Ehrlich was wrong about too many people. Now Elon Musk is telling us the catastrophe is too few people. The direction of panic has reversed. The pattern of the panic has not. And the error is always the same one. A real trend gets extrapolated forever. Human adaptation gets ignored, and someone with a very large audience decides they found the thing that finally ends us. So what is actually driving birth rates down? And why has every country that has ever industrialized followed the same trajectory? The answer has a name: the demographic transition. It is one of the most well-documented patterns in all social sciences. As countries develop, child mortality falls first. Parents who had been having many children partly as insurance against the high probability that some would die adjust gradually to a world where more children survive. Women gain access to education, then to economic opportunity. And the single most powerful driver of fertility decline in the entire literature, more powerful than any government policy, more powerful than contraceptive access, and more powerful than any other variable, is the education of women. Not as a side effect, a mechanism. Educated women have more options. They exercise them. Birth rates fall. Lower fertility rates, in other words, are almost mechanically correlated with women having more control over their own lives. When Elon Musk frames low fertility as civilization's greatest threat, he is, whether he intends to or not, framing women's liberation as civilization's greatest threat. You don't have to take my word for that. Just follow the mechanism. The countries Musk is most alarmed about, South Korea, Japan, Italy, are countries that have successfully completed the demographic transition. They have low child mortality, high female education, high urbanization, high prosperity. Their low birth rates are the expected output of those conditions. The countries with high birth rates are, largely, countries that have not yet completed that transition. East Germany in the early 1990s gives us the most useful historical data point on what the most alarming version of today's numbers actually produces. After reunification, as economic disruptions sent unemployment soaring past 20%, East Germany's fertility rate crashed to 0.8, comparable to South Korea's current rate of 0.73, the figure Musk has called mass extinction numbers. Demographers at the time genuinely debated whether they were watching a society in catastrophic freefall. By the mid-1990s, fertility was already rising again. By 2008, East Germany's birth rate had overtaken West Germany's. The mass extinction number lasted roughly one generation and then bounced. No famine, no collapse, a generation that delayed childbearing during a period of profound disruption and then resumed. Japan, which has been shrinking longer than any other major country, offers the long-term view. Genuine fiscal strain on pension systems, yes, but also the highest life expectancy on Earth and the second largest economy in the G7. The canary in the coal mine is living longer than anyone else on the planet. In April of 2022, Musk wrote that population collapse due to low birth rates was the greatest risk to civilization. The foundation of the economy, he argued, is labor. There are not enough people, and that is the core problem. In that same period, he was telling investors that Tesla's humanoid robot, Optimus, had the potential to be a generalized substitute for human labor over time, that automation would solve the labor shortage the declining birth rate was creating, and that up to 80% of Tesla's long-term value would come from robotics. In January 2026, he said AI and robotics would make work optional and money stop being relevant within a generation. You cannot simultaneously argue that civilization needs exponentially more workers and that civilization is about to have more workers than it knows what to do with. One of those positions makes the other irrelevant. He is using the same underlying anxiety, not enough labor, to justify two incompatible solutions depending on which company he happens to be pitching that day. And then there is the Doge layer. While broadcasting the collapse narrative, Musk was leading an effort to systematically reduce the federal workforce, firing workers by the tens of thousands. While warning that low birth rates meant a labor shortage, he championed mass deportation of the very immigrants keeping American population growth alive. The UN projects immigration will be the main driver of population growth in over 50 countries through 2054. The people raising the loudest alarms about collapse are often the same ones working hardest to shut that door. It's worth being honest. Immigration is not a structural fix. Immigrants age too. One study found that raising the retirement age by a single year did as much for workforce balance as adding 43 million immigrants. Immigration helps, it doesn't solve the math. Pronatalist policies, the idea that governments can simply incentivize more babies, have been tried at enormous scale and produced almost nothing. South Korea has spent over $200 billion on birth rate incentives. Its fertility rate continued to fall. Hungary spent 6% of its entire GDP on family support and watched its fertility rate briefly rise. Then, under closer examination, researchers found the rise was mostly a timing effect. People having children they would have had anyways, but slightly sooner. By 2024, Hungary's fertility rate had fallen to its lowest point in a decade. You cannot bribe people into having more children when the underlying conditions that made large families desirable, high child mortality, agricultural economies, limited options for women, no longer exist. The conditions that produce low birth rates are the conditions of a successful, educated, prosperous society. Treating them as symptoms of disease means treating prosperity itself as the problem. But there is also something else happening in this conversation, and it has a name. It is called the Great Replacement, the theory promoted across significant portions of the far right that immigration and declining birth rates among white populations are not coincidental trends, but a coordinated project of erasure. That the real crisis isn't falling birth rates in general, it is falling birth rates among the right people. Musk has not said this in those words, but the pattern in what he has said is worth examining carefully. He has expressed particular concern about declining fertility among the higher educated, a category that, in the demographic context he is discussing, maps almost entirely onto Western and East Asian populations. His from where dismissal of immigration was not a mathematical objection. The populations with room to grow are in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, as the UN data makes abundantly clear, and Musk is not unaware of. Researchers who studied the 2023 NATO conference, a gathering of prominent pronatalists whose public policies align closely with Musk's stated concerns, found that for a significant portion of attendees, the goal was not raising birth rates broadly, it was encouraging specific populations, predominantly white populations, to have more children. Musk has used his platform to promote a softer version of the replacement narrative, that Democrats deliberately expand immigration in order to displace existing voting populations. None of this means that everyone concerned about aging workforces or pension systems is a white nationalist. Many people raising these concerns are doing exactly that, raising legitimate policy concerns that deserve serious answers. But it does explain why immigration never satisfies the loudest voices in this conversation, regardless of the math. Immigration solves the number. It cannot solve an anxiety that was never really about the number. That is why the same voices warning that civilization will collapse from too few people are so often the same voices building walls, restricting legal immigration, and deporting the workers researchers say are the most practical near-term buffer against an aging population. The math has never been the point. The math is the cover story. What Musk is doing follows a pattern as old as demographic data itself. A real trend gets extrapolated to catastrophe, the mechanisms of human adaptation are ignored, the enormous cultural anxiety is generated. Malthus in 1798, Ehrlich in 1968, Musk in 2022. The predictions have a perfect track record of being wrong, for exactly the same reason. Every time someone forgets that humans adapt, that innovation responds to scarcity, that demographic change moves slowly enough for societies to find their footing. Musk has been right about things people dismiss. He may be right that some countries face genuine fiscal strain. Pension systems will need rethinking, and that is not a small problem. But on population catastrophe predictions specifically, he is in very particular company. Malthus was certain. Ehrlich was certain enough to bet money on it. Both were right about the trend. Both were catastrophically wrong about what it meant. What the trend means is this. Low birth rates are the expected, well-documented output of a world that got better. A world where fewer children died, where women have real choices, where prosperity reduced the economic necessity of large families. The world that produced the birth rates Musk is alarmed about also produced longer lives, better health, and more human freedom than any previous era in history. It also produced a world whose population is growing fastest in Africa and South Asia, and that geography, not the fertility rate, is what the alarm is actually pointing at. The next time you see Musk post that population collapse is the greatest threat to civilization, remember what collapse actually looked like. Remember Florida in 1700, 700,000 people, then 2,000. Remember Rome losing 2,000 people a day to a plague no one could explain. Remember the graveyard the pilgrims built their colony on top of. And then remember East Germany, a fertility rate of 0.8, the same range as the mass extinction numbers Musk cites today, bouncing back within a single generation without famine and without civilizational breakdown. That is what is collapsing, not the number of people, the narrative that there were never enough of the right ones.